Welcome to Creepy Mysteries. Before moving to the story, I just want to take a moment. Every story here is crafted to take you on a spine-chilling journey. If you enjoy what you hear and want more tales of the unknown, consider subscribing to the channel. It truly means the world to us. And if this story intrigued you, let us know by liking the video and sharing your thoughts in the comments. Your feedback helps us uncover even more mysteries to share with you. Now let's move on to the story. This happened 2 years ago when my girlfriend Emma and I went on a winter hike in a national park. We're both outdoorsy people, and we'd been looking forward to this trip for weeks. The idea of walking through snow-covered trails, surrounded by the quiet of the forest, sounded perfect. But what started as a peaceful getaway turned into the most terrifying experience of my life. The hike started off fine. It was a clear, crisp winter morning. We stuck to one of the main trails, which was marked and easy to follow despite the fresh layer of snow. It was just the two of us, and the only sounds were the crunching of our boots and the occasional gust of wind through the trees. About 2 hours in, we came across a narrow path branching off from the main trail. It wasn't marked, and it wasn't on the map we'd picked up at the visitor center. It looked barely used, almost hidden, but the fresh snowfall had left it untouched. And the way the sun gleamed off the path made it oddly inviting. "Let's check it out," I said. Emma hesitated. She was always more cautious than me, but eventually she agreed. As soon as we stepped onto the path, something felt off. It was colder here, much colder than it had been on the main trail. The trees seemed taller, their bare branches reaching upward like skeletal hands. And it was quiet, too quiet. There were no sounds of birds, no rustling in the underbrush, just the eerie silence of snow muffling everything around us. About 15 minutes in, we saw the first statue. It was a deer, frozen mid-leap, its body impossibly detailed. You could see every curve of its muscles, every strand of fur. At first, I thought it was just an ice sculpture, but when I touched it, I realized it wasn't smooth like ice. It felt rough, almost organic, and the cold coming off it was unnatural. It made my fingers ache instantly. "That's weird," Emma said. She was clearly uncomfortable, but I was fascinated. We kept walking, and soon we came across more statues. There was a fox frozen mid-run, its eyes wide with fear. A rabbit crouched low as if hiding. They all looked so real, so lifelike, but there were no signs of footprints, no evidence that anyone had been out here creating them. Then we saw the human statues. The first one was a man, his arms stretched out in front of him, as if trying to shield himself from something. His face was contorted in terror, his mouth open in a silent scream. A few feet away was a woman, crouched low, her hands covering her face. "Okay, we're turning back," Emma said firmly, but I was drawn in. I needed to know what this was. "Just a little further," I said. "I want to see if there's more." She reluctantly followed me, and the further we went, the more statues we saw. There was a child, maybe 10 years old, standing perfectly still with their hands clasped together. A group of 3 people huddled close, as if they'd been caught in the middle of something terrible. And then we saw the clearing. It was a wide, open space in the forest, and in the center stood the largest statue yet. It was a towering figure, maybe 15 feet tall, cloaked in thick, jagged ice. It held a massive staff in one hand, and its face, if you could call it that, was featureless, just a blank, icy void. Emma grabbed my arm. "We're leaving, now." She was right. The air here was freezing, far colder than anywhere else on the trail. My breath came out in quick, visible puffs, and the hairs on the back of my neck were standing up. But as we turned to leave, I noticed something. All the statues we'd passed before, they were all facing the clearing now. Their frozen faces were turned toward us. And then the whispers started. At first I thought it was the wind, but it wasn't. It was voices, faint and distant, coming from all around us. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but they sounded wrong, distorted. We started running. The trail we'd followed was gone. The snow was undisturbed, as if we'd never walked on it. The forest felt endless, and the whispers were getting louder, more frantic. I turned to look behind us and froze. The towering figure from the clearing was standing at the edge of the trees, its blank face tilted slightly as though it was watching us. "Run!" Emma screamed, pulling me forward. We sprinted through the snow, our breaths ragged, our legs burning. The whispers turned into a low, guttural growl, echoing through the trees. At one point, I swear I felt something brush against my shoulder, but I didn't dare look back. Finally, we broke through the trees and stumbled back onto the main trail. The growling stopped instantly, and the oppressive cold lifted. I turned back, and the forest behind us was still and silent. The strange path was gone, as if it had never existed. We didn't say a word as we hiked back to the car. That night, I had nightmares of the statues, their frozen faces turned toward me. Sometimes I still hear the whispers when it's quiet, faint and distant, like they're calling me back. I haven't gone hiking in the winter since. This story was sent in by someone I'll call Ethan. It's about a family camping trip that turned into a nightmare, leaving Ethan questioning if they were alone in the woods or if someone or something was watching them the entire time. It happened last summer when Ethan, his wife Emily, and their 9-year-old daughter Claire decided to take a weekend trip to a remote camping spot in the mountains. They wanted to get away from the noise and stress of city life and spend some time together as a family. The campsite they chose was deep in the woods, a solid 2-hour drive from the nearest town. It wasn't an official campground, just a clearing near a small lake that Ethan had visited once years ago with friends. It was perfect, secluded, peaceful, and surrounded by towering pine trees. They arrived in the late afternoon, unloaded their gear, and set up camp. As the sun began to set, the forest came alive with the sounds of crickets and the occasional hoot of an owl. They built a fire, roasted marshmallows, and shared stories under the stars. It was everything they had hoped for, until the first strange thing happened. Around midnight, after Claire had fallen asleep in the tent, Ethan and Emily stayed by the fire, talking quietly. That's when they heard it, a faint rustling in the trees just beyond the glow of the firelight. Ethan assumed it was a raccoon or some other animal, but Emily looked uneasy. "That sounded bigger than a raccoon," she whispered. Ethan grabbed a flashlight and shone it toward the trees. The beam of light cut through the darkness, but there was nothing there. The rustling stopped. "Probably just the wind," Ethan said, trying to reassure her. Emily nodded, but she didn't look convinced. They decided to call it a night and headed into the tent. Ethan was almost asleep when he heard it again. This time it wasn't rustling. It was footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps circling their campsite. He sat up, his heart racing. "Emily, wake up," he whispered, shaking her shoulder. She stirred, groggy. "What is it?" "Listen." The footsteps stopped. There was silence and then a faint, almost imperceptible whisper, like someone talking just out of earshot. Ethan unzipped the tent quietly and peeked outside. The fire had burned down to embers, casting just enough light to see the campsite. But there was no one there. He stepped out with the flashlight, scanning the trees. Still nothing, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming, almost suffocating. Ethan eventually convinced himself it was just his imagination and went back to bed, though he didn't sleep much that night. The next morning they woke up to find something strange. Their cooler, which they had left outside the tent, had been moved about 10 feet from where they had left it. The lid was open and some of their food was scattered on the ground. "Looks like an animal got into it," Ethan said, though deep down he wasn't so sure. Emily frowned. "Why would an animal move the whole cooler?" Ethan didn't have an answer. They spent the day hiking and swimming in the lake, trying to shake off the uneasiness of the previous night. By the time they got back to the campsite, the sun was setting and they were all exhausted. Ethan rebuilt the fire and they cooked dinner. As the night went on, that same uneasy feeling crept back. It felt like the woods were too quiet, like the usual sounds of nature had disappeared. Emily noticed it too. "Doesn't it feel off?" she asked. Ethan nodded but didn't want to scare Claire, so he kept his voice calm. "Let's just stick close to the fire tonight." Around 11 p.m., Claire fell asleep in Emily's lap, and they decided to put her to bed. Ethan carried her to the tent while Emily stayed by the fire. When Ethan came back out, Emily was staring into the trees, her face pale. "What is it?" he asked. "I saw someone," she whispered. Ethan's stomach dropped. "What do you mean? Where?" She pointed toward the edge of the clearing. "There, by that tree. I saw a person just standing there, watching us." Ethan grabbed the flashlight and shone it in the direction she pointed. But again, there was nothing. "You sure it wasn't a shadow or something?" "I know what I saw, Ethan. There was someone there." He didn't doubt her. The feeling of being watched had been there since they arrived. They decided to stay up and keep watch, taking turns while the other rested. Ethan sat by the fire, his eyes scanning the darkness, while Emily dozed in the tent with Claire. Around 2 a.m., Ethan heard it again, those slow, deliberate footsteps. This time they were closer. He grabbed the flashlight and stood up, his heart pounding. "Who's out there?" he called, trying to keep his voice steady. There was no response, but the footsteps stopped. Ethan's hands were shaking as he moved toward the edge of the clearing. The flashlight beam cut through the darkness, and for a moment, he thought he saw movement, a shadow disappearing behind a tree. "Hey, I know you're there!" he yelled, trying to sound braver than he felt. The forest was silent. He stood there for what felt like an eternity, listening, but the footsteps didn't return. Finally, he went back to the fire and sat down, his adrenaline still pumping. The rest of the night passed without incident, but by morning, Ethan had made up his mind. "We're leaving," he told Emily as soon as she woke up. She didn't argue. They packed up their gear quickly, and that's when they found it. A single footprint in the dirt near their tent. It was unmistakably human, but what sent a chill down Ethan's spine was the size of it. It was far too big to belong to him, Emily, or anyone else he had ever seen. They didn't stick around to think about it. Within an hour, they were back on the road heading home. Ethan never reported the incident to the police, and he never went back to that campsite. To this day, he doesn't know who or what was out there in the woods with them. But one thing is certain, they were not alone. That's for today from Creepy Mysteries. Hope you enjoyed the stories. If you enjoyed the stories and want more tales that send chills down your spine, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new upload. And remember, the scariest stories are often the ones that feel a little too real. Until next time, stay safe and stay in the light.